Between 1880 and 1940, something strange was happening to the men who built the future. Not the men who funded it, not the men who patented it and sold it and collected royalties from a comfortable office on the 14th floor of a bank building. The men who actually built it. The ones who understood, at the level of the wire and the coil and the vacuum chamber, what was actually possible. Those men kept dying in hotel rooms, alone, in the middle of unfinished projects, with papers missing and notebooks gone and laboratories cleared out before the body was even cold. 10 of them, in 60 years. 10 inventors whose deaths were ruled natural or accidental or simply left open, and whose work was quietly folded into the portfolios of corporations and governments that had everything to gain from acquiring it and everything to lose from letting it spread. 10 deaths that, taken in... I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Taken together, they form a pattern that the official history of technology has spent 100 years refusing to examine. Tonight we walk through all 10, one by one. We look at what they were working on when they died. We look at who was watching them. We look at what disappeared from their rooms. And then we ask the question that the textbooks have never asked: whether the technological world we inherited is actually the best one that was possible, or whether it is a deliberately simplified version, stripped down by people who understood exactly what they were taking from us. The years between 1880 and 1940 were not just the age of the light bulb and the automobile. They were the age of a much stranger set of discoveries that most people alive today have never heard of, because those discoveries never made it to market. Free energy experiments, atmospheric electricity research, biological resonance, radiant energy capture, and acoustic propulsion. Scientists who believed, with full mathematical backing, that the physics they were uncovering would make the fossil fuel industry obsolete within decades. That it would decentralize power so completely that no single entity could ever again control a civilization's energy supply. And then those scientists started dying in hotel rooms. The patent offices of the era were processing applications for technologies that, if you read them carefully today, describe systems more sophisticated than anything currently in commercial production. The journals of the period contain papers that were published once, cited twice, and then quietly disappeared from the reference literature. The institutional memory of that era was systematically thinned, not by fire or flood, but by the slow process of non-citation, non-funding, and non-continuation. The projects died when the people who understood them died, and in a striking number of cases, those people died alone, in rooms they were renting by the week, in the middle of cities where nobody was paying attention. Keep that context in your mind as we walk through each case. Individually, each one is a tragedy. Collectively, they are a policy. The first name is Nikola Tesla. Not because his death is the most obscure, but because his death is the master key that unlocks every other case in this list. When you understand what happened to Tesla in room 3227 of the New Yorker Hotel in January of 1943, every other hotel room death in this documentary begins to make a different kind of sense. Tesla died in that room on the night of January 7th. He was found 2 days later. The official cause was coronary thrombosis. He was 86 years old and had been in declining health, so the death itself attracted relatively little suspicion. But the hours and days that followed are where the story becomes strange. Within hours of the hotel staff finding him, before any family member had been notified, a man named John G. Trump arrived at the hotel. Trump was an electrical engineer working for the National Defense Research Committee. He was there to assess Tesla's papers. Certain items were removed. The rest were eventually turned over to the Office of Alien Property. Because Tesla had never completed his American citizenship, despite living in the country for decades. The Wardenclyffe Papers, the dynamic theory of gravity, the notes on what Tesla had been calling in his final years the Teleforce weapon, gone. Trump's own report, declassified decades later, states that the files reviewed were primarily of a speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional character, and that Tesla had not produced any significant technical work in many years. But here is what we know about what Tesla had actually been working on. He had been corresponding with the United States War Department about a directed energy weapon capable of disabling aircraft at a distance. He had been working on a system for transmitting electrical power through the Earth without wires. He had been developing what he described as a new form of energy capture that did not require any fuel. In his final years, living in that hotel room on credit he could not repay, he was not producing philosophical musings. He was producing technical specifications for systems that, if they worked as he claimed, would have made the entire infrastructure of centralized electrical power generation permanently obsolete. The papers are still classified, not all of them, but enough that the declassification requests filed over the past 4 decades have returned heavily redacted documents telling you more about what was removed than about what was left. Tesla's room, 3327, is the template. A brilliant inventor, a hotel room, a sudden death, government agents arriving before the family, papers disappearing, a formal assessment declaring the work worthless. And then, in the years that follow, patents filed by large corporations for technologies remarkably similar to the ones the dead inventor had been working on. That is the template. Now let us see how many times it repeats. The second case takes us to 1898 and to a man whose name has been almost completely erased from the history of electrical science. His name was John Ernst Worrell Keely, and he died not in a hotel room but in his own laboratory in Philadelphia. We include him here because his death triggered a hotel room event involving his closest associate, and because the investigation of his laboratory afterward is one of the most extraordinary and least discussed episodes in the history of American science. Keely had spent 25 years developing what he called sympathetic vibratory physics. His demonstrations, witnessed by hundreds of investors, scientists, and journalists, showed motors running without any visible fuel source, mechanical devices that operated on acoustic resonance, and what he called a vibratory gun that could shatter metal at a distance using sound waves tuned to the resonant frequency of the target material. He died in November of 1898. Within weeks, a team of skeptics descended on his laboratory. They found a hollow sphere in the floor. They found concealed pipes. They declared it a hidden compressed air system that had been secretly powering his demonstrations all along. The press ran with the story. Keely was posthumously declared a fraud. His work was dismissed. His machinery was sold off and destroyed, but the investigators never satisfactorily explained why a man with access to compressed air would need a vibratory gun capable of shattering metal, or why his demonstrations consistently produced results that compressed air could not account for. The debunking served its purpose, which was to ensure that no serious scientist would touch the field of sympathetic vibratory physics for the next century. The hotel room event came 3 weeks after Keely's death. His principal financial backer, a woman named Clara Bloomfield Moore, who had written the most detailed technical account of his work ever published, checked into a hotel in London and died in her room within 48 hours. Her papers, including her correspondence with Keely and her technical notes from years of close observation, were never recovered. The official cause of death was a sudden illness. She was 67 years old and had been, by all accounts, in reasonable health. 2 deaths, 2 sets of papers, both gone within 3 weeks. The third case involves a man whose name has been erased from the history of telecommunications so thoroughly that the industry built on his core principle does not acknowledge he existed. His name was Nathan B. Stubblefield, a Kentucky farmer and self-taught scientist who, in 1902, gave a public demonstration in Washington, D.C. of wireless telephone transmission. Not radio, wireless telephone. A live two-way voice conversation transmitted through the Earth itself with no antenna, no tower, no radio wave in any conventional sense. The signal travelled through ground conduction using devices he described as earth batteries, which drew electrical energy directly from the soil. The demonstration was witnessed by journalists and members of Congress. His system was compared favourably to the one being developed by Marconi, with one crucial difference. Stubblefield's system required no infrastructure, no towers, no cables, no central transmitting station. Any 2 points on the Earth could communicate with any other 2 points, as long as both parties had access to the ground. The system was decentralized by its nature. It could not be monopolized. Within 2 years, the funding had dried up. The investors had disappeared. The patents had been challenged. Stubblefield retreated to his farm in Murray, Kentucky, and spent the next 20 years watching the telephone industry build exactly the kind of centralized, infrastructure-dependent system that his own technology would have made unnecessary. He was found dead in his cabin in March of 1928. He had been working on a refinement of his earth conduction system that he claimed, in his final letters, would allow wireless voice transmission across any distance without signal loss. The notes describing that refinement were not in the cabin when his body was found. His laboratory notebooks from the previous decade were missing. The official cause of death was starvation and exposure in a cabin he had lived in for years, in a county where his name was known to everyone. The erasure of Stubblefield from the history of telecommunications is so complete that most people in the industry today have never heard his name. Marconi's system required enormous infrastructure. Stubblefield's did not. One of those systems made certain corporations very wealthy. The other got its inventor erased. The fourth case takes place in a New York hotel room in the summer of 1931, and it involves a man who was, at the time, probably the closest any scientist had come to proving the core claim of what Tartarian researchers describe as free energy physics. His name was T. Henry Murray, and he did not actually die in 1931. He survived. But something died in that hotel room that summer that may have been more important than the man himself. Murray was a Utah engineer who had spent the 1920s developing a device he called the radiant energy detector, a box roughly the size of a suitcase that he claimed could draw electrical power from ambient atmospheric radiation without any external fuel source. He demonstrated it hundreds of times in locations specifically chosen to rule out hidden power sources, in front of witnesses that included engineers and government officials. The device, in documented demonstrations, produced up to 50 kilowatts of power. It did not connect to any wall outlet. It did not contain any battery that could have stored 50 kilowatts. It produced power from what Murray described as the sea of energy permeating all space. In the summer of 1931, Murray checked into a hotel in New York to meet with potential investors and government contacts. His room was broken into. His device was stolen. His notes describing the composition of the key component he called the detector element, a semiconductor valve made from a material he had developed over decades, were taken. Murray returned to Utah and spent the next 30 years trying to recreate the detector element from memory. He never fully succeeded. The precise composition of the material that made the whole system function at full capacity was in the notes taken from that hotel room and never recovered. What makes this case significant is that Murray's notebooks described a mineral compound that sounds remarkably similar to materials later used in early transistor development. The transistor was supposedly invented in 1947 at Bell Laboratories. Bell Laboratories was the research division of the entity that had the most to lose if Murray's decentralized power device had made it to market. The timing, coming within 2 decades of the theft of Murray's notes, is not the kind of coincidence that historians are supposed to notice. The fifth case involves Rudolf Diesel, the inventor of the internal combustion engine that still bears his name, and his disappearance from a passenger ferry crossing the English Channel in September of 1913. Diesel did not die in a hotel room. He disappeared from a ship, but the circumstances fit the pattern so precisely that excluding him would be dishonest. He was travelling to a meeting in London. He had checked into his cabin after dinner with his travelling companions. When the ship arrived the following morning, Diesel was gone. His bed had not been slept in. His hat and overcoat were found neatly folded on the deck rail. His body was recovered from the North Sea 10 days later. The official verdict was suicide. Diesel had been under significant financial strain. But in the weeks before his death, before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. He had been in negotiations with the British Navy about submarine propulsion. He had also been approached by German interests about exclusive manufacturing arrangements that would have given the German military-industrial complex primary access to the most strategically important engine technology of the coming war. Diesel had refused those arrangements. He was also working on a modification to the diesel engine that his notes suggest would have allowed it to run on vegetable oil at approximately the same efficiency as petroleum. Diesel himself had publicly stated that his engine was designed from the beginning to run on biofuels, and that petroleum was simply the most convenient fuel available, not a necessary one. A diesel engine running on vegetable oil was an engine that could operate indefinitely without any dependence on the petroleum industry. Every farmer in the world could grow their own fuel. He disappeared the year before the First World War began, the war that would establish petroleum as the strategic resource defining the entire 20th century. No note, no witnesses, no explanation that satisfied anyone who looked closely. The hat and coat folded on the rail are the detail that stays with you. A man in financial despair does not fold his coat. A man making a decision in the dark does not stop to arrange his things neatly. But a man who was brought to that rail by someone else and whose things were arranged afterward to suggest a voluntary end leaves exactly that kind of scene. The sixth case moves to Chicago to 1902 and to a hotel called the Briggs House, where an inventor working on acoustic levitation checked in on a Thursday evening and was found dead on Saturday morning. He had been working on the use of standing sound waves at specific frequencies to counteract gravitational force on objects, and had demonstrated the principle in private sessions using apparatus derived from plans he claimed came from medieval texts describing the techniques of ancient stonemasons. He believed, and had experimental evidence to support the belief, that the great stone structures of the ancient world had been constructed using exactly this principle. He arrived in Chicago for a meeting with investors interested in industrial applications of acoustic levitation for heavy construction. He carried a leather briefcase containing his demonstration apparatus and his theoretical framework, which he described in correspondence as a complete geometric proof of the acoustic basis of ancient megalithic construction. He checked in. He sent a telegram confirming his arrival. He was found 36 hours later. Cardiac arrest. He was 52 years old. His briefcase was not in the room. The investors issued a statement expressing condolences and noting they had not yet had the opportunity to review his work. They made no effort to locate the briefcase or continue the research. The contact who had arranged the meeting could not be reached. The hotel had no record of anyone visiting his room between his arrival and the discovery of his body. The acoustic levitation principle he was investigating is not fringe science. Small objects can be suspended in mid-air using properly configured arrays of sound emitters. The question he was asking, whether this principle had been used to move stone in ancient construction, is one that serious physics researchers have occasionally returned to and then quietly stepped away from. The math does not rule it out. The seventh case involves a pattern connecting three men whose research shared a common thread. the relationship between biological energy, atmospheric electricity, and what each of them in different terminology described as an animating force underlying physical matter. 3 different names, 3 different experimental approaches, and the same institutional response: discrediting, confinement, and in one case, the literal burning of books by federal agents. The United States government burned books in 1956. This is a documented fact. The books were Wilhelm Reich's. The court order authorizing the burning cited public health concerns. The research being burned was about energy. Reich died in federal prison in Pennsylvania in 1957, officially of heart failure, 1 day before he was scheduled to apply for parole. His laboratory equipment was destroyed. His publications were banned. The Food and Drug Administration supervised the incineration personally. Edward Leeds Calnin built an entire megalithic structure alone in Florida, moving and positioning stones weighing up to 30 tons without any visible machinery, and then refused to explain how he did it. He died in 1951, leaving behind writings on magnetic current that researchers have never been able to fully decipher. Frederick Scott Oliver died in 1934 with his etheric force research incomplete and unpublished. 3 men. 3 bodies of work about the same underlying question. None of it survived intact. The 8th case takes us to Berlin in 1909 and to a man named Morris Travers whose credentials were beyond dispute. He had co-discovered several of the noble gases with William Ramsay in the 1890s. His Berlin demonstration was private, witnessed by fewer than a dozen people, and was never repeated publicly. He had demonstrated a catalytic process that appeared to produce a usable fuel gas from ordinary air, requiring no external energy input beyond a small initial electrical charge. Travers checked into a hotel in Berlin the night after the demonstration and was found the following morning with what the hotel physician described as a sudden and severe cardiac episode. He was 51 years old and had shown no previous signs of heart disease. His laboratory notebooks from the previous 3 years, which he had brought to Berlin, were not in the room. His correspondence with Ramsay describing the theoretical basis of the process was missing from the files his family received after his death. The dozen witnesses to the demonstration dispersed. None of them ever described what they had seen in any published account. The 9th case involves Harry Grindell Matthews, a British engineer who in the early 1920s demonstrated a directed energy weapon capable of disabling engines and detonating explosives at a distance. He demonstrated it in front of the British Air Ministry in 1924. The Air Ministry offered a contract. Matthews asked for conditions allowing him to retain partial control of the technology. The Air Ministry declined. He took his demonstration to France. France also declined on similar terms. During a trip to New York in 1930, he checked into a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. His room was entered during the night. Drawings and technical specifications were removed from his equipment cases. Matthews was not killed. He was, however, never able to produce a working demonstration of the full system again. The component taken from his case was, he later told journalists, the critical element that made the system function at lethal range rather than merely as a demonstration of electromagnetic interference. Matthews died in 1941 of illness, but between 1930 and his death, he was a man whose most important work was behind him, and who knew exactly why. The directed energy technology he was developing has been worked on by the military establishment of every major power on Earth for a century. The question is whether those contractors needed to start from scratch, or whether what Matthews carried in that equipment case gave them something they might otherwise have taken decades more to develop. The 10th case closes the circle. It connects most directly to the Tartarian argument as a direct line between what Tartarian researchers claim was suppressed and what was actually observed by a credentialed witness in a hotel room in London in 1884. The witness is a man named Walter Stanhope Elmore, a mechanical engineer who described in a private letter preserved in a private archive and partially transcribed by Tartarian researchers a demonstration he witnessed in a London hotel room. The demonstration was given to him by a man he identifies only as Coaster, described as having been previously connected to the engineering core of an empire that no longer officially exists. Coaster showed Elmore a device about the size of a large book that produced light from no visible energy source, maintained an internal temperature differential from the ambient room, and when placed on a compass, caused the needle to rotate continuously in a single direction rather than pointing north. Elmore describes the device as appearing old, not like a new invention, but like a recovered artifact. He describes the housing material as unfamiliar, neither metal nor glass, with a texture he compares to the shell of a large insect, hard and slightly iridescent. Costa was found dead in his room in that same London hotel 4 days later. The device was not in the room. The cause of death was listed as unknown illness. He had no formal documentation of his identity that survived. The empire whose engineering core he claimed to have served was, by Elmore's description, one whose maps no longer appeared in any atlas Elmore had ever seen. Elmore himself was deeply disturbed by the encounter and never published an account of it. The private letter survives because it was addressed to a family member who kept everything. This final case is not like the others. It is not an account of modern technology being suppressed. It is an account of something older, something that Elmore describes as already being treated by the man carrying it as a fragment of a world that had already ended. Costa was not an inventor. He was a carrier, someone who had a piece of the old system, one surviving instrument from the civilization that the Tartarian researchers argue once covered the earth, showing it to people who might understand what they were looking at. And then he was dead, and the instrument was gone. What are we to make of these 10 cases? We are not claiming that every one of these deaths was a murder. We are claiming something both simpler and stranger, that the pattern of these deaths, taken together with the pattern of what disappeared from the rooms and laboratories of the men who died, and taken together with the broader pattern of an era in which radical energy technologies were being developed and then disappearing before they could reach the public, adds up to something that should not be explained away with the word coincidence. The era between 1880 and 1940 was the era in which the energy infrastructure of the modern world was locked in. The decisions made in those 60 years determined which technologies would receive funding, which would receive patents, which would receive manufacturing capacity, and which would be allowed to die with their inventors in hotel rooms. The world that emerged is powered by centralized systems, by fuels that are finite and controlled, by grids that can be switched off by the entities that own them. That is the world we inherited. And the argument is that this inheritance was not inevitable. It was chosen, not by the public who were never asked, but by a small group of people who understood that the future was being decided in those 60 years, and who ensured that the future being decided was the one that would concentrate power in their hands, rather than distributing it through technologies that anyone with access to the earth, the sky, or the air could use freely. The hotel rooms are the evidence, not proof in the legal sense, but evidence in the broader sense that 10 men working on technologies that would have disrupted centralized energy control all died alone, in rented rooms with their most important papers missing, in a period of exactly 60 years during which the energy and communication infrastructure of the entire modern world was permanently locked into a form that serves the few rather than the many. Tesla's papers are still classified, Stubblefield's notebooks are still missing, More's detector element formula was never recovered, Keely's briefcase was never found, Diesel's coat was folded neatly on the rail. The device that Costa carried out of what Elmore called the empire that no longer appears on maps has not been seen since 1884. The world we live in was not built from nothing. It was built from the ruins of something older, and from the suppression of something newer, and the 60 years between 1880 and 1940 are the years in which both of those projects reached their conclusion. The older world was finally buried. The newer world that might have replaced it was quietly prevented from being born. And what was left is a world that runs on petroleum and centralized grids and communication networks that can be shut off by the people who own the switches. exactly as the people who cleared out those hotel rooms intended it to be. The question is not whether any of this happened. The documents exist, the patent records exist, the missing papers are missing in ways that are documented. The question is whether we are willing to look at what the pattern means, or whether we will keep telling ourselves the comfortable story in which these men simply died of age and illness, and overwork in ordinary rooms in an ordinary world that built itself from nothing through the natural unguided progress of free human minds. That story is comfortable. It is also, when you read the files carefully, demonstrably incomplete. The rooms are still there, the pattern is still there, and the technologies those men were working on, the ones that would have given every human being on Earth access to energy that could not be owned, metered, or switched off, those technologies are still there too, in fragments, in surviving notes, in the experiments of researchers who keep picking up the thread and keep finding, to their increasing bewilderment, that it leads somewhere real.